that will help you to improve your web coding skills, and I will also show you how you can write two MCP server within the same JSON file. So let's look at the live demo. MCP is all over the internet. I got you covered with the 3 video series that one must watch to upskill themselves in this field. The part 1 will cover what is MCP and how you can improve your web coding skills with MCP. In part 2, we will build an agent using Google ADK Agent Development Kit connected with MCP. And in the last part, we will build our own MCP server and client. So let's get started. To set up the context, let's understand the issues with large language models in terms of what LLMs can do and what LLMs can't do. Here is one example. LLMs can write an email, but LLMs can't send an email. In the same way, LLM can help you write a description for calendar invite, but it can't send a calendar invite with the guest list added. Lastly, LLMs can write a search query, but it can't browse the web independently. Now you might argue, hey, if I go to ChatGPT, I can directly search a web browser and get the details. Yes, you're correct. But when it comes to the base models like GPT, Gemini, they can't directly browse the internet. You're adding a functionality of function calling and the action step. For example, if you need to search anything, it will directly trigger the search function call and it will get you the result. But the base model, which is a large language model, it is not capable to browse the web automatically. You need to give some kind of tool functionality so that it can take that specific action. Now, if you understand this entire process, what you're trying to do is you're using a tool, you're getting the context, based on that context, you're performing certain action, right? So this is where the concept arises, such as model context protocol. So we have model. This model is nothing but you have large language model or an agents. Now, when it comes to language models, right, they have very limited context. So this is where via tool, what you're trying to do is you're giving the additional context. So this tool is nothing but your API call. So you have the APIs. This APIs will provide the additional context to the model. Now, lastly, we have protocol. Protocol, in simple words, it's nothing but set of rules, right? So now, why is protocol required in this scenario? So when it comes to large language models, if you want to integrate a calendar, you need to write a custom code for calendar. If you need to connect a search to the language model, you need to write the integration for search. In the same way, whenever you want to connect any integration with large language model, you need to write an additional custom function or function calling code. So this is where protocol is just standardizing that process so that you don't repeat anything. So when it comes to MCP, it's not a new concept. You have function calling. You can create those multiple functions in the standardized way, give the additional context to the LLM model. But the only thing what MCP does is it provides that in a structured way so that you don't have to think of multiple integrations or custom integration, right? So in simple words, you have a model. This model needs the context. It is hungry in order to get that context. And this context is provided in the standardized rules using the protocol. In simple words, you can just think you have a AI model and you have a MCP. It's nothing but you're connecting as a USB. MCP mainly consists of 4 major components, and those 4 components are host, MCP client, then we have transport layer, and lastly we have MCP server. So now let's understand how each and every component works in a MCP architecture setup. So we will start off with host. Host basically is you have multiple MCP client setup where user can interact with, right? So let me quickly draw a setup where we have multiple client, right? So we have client 1. So let me add client 1. This is nothing but we have Claude Desktop, right? So now let me quickly add client 2. So client 2 is where we have our cursor IDE. So you understood, wherever your client are hosted, which is your local system or remote system. For example, Claude, right? It's a large language model developed by Anthropic. If you want to write any coding related task, you can just ask your prompt and get better results at it. Same goes with cursor IDE. It helps you, it's like a co-pilot, right? It's your AI companion to write code. So this is where you have your MCP client setup. And now let's understand what is the purpose of MCP client. So the only purpose of MCP client is to interact with the external data, get the information from the data, and then execute to the user, right? Now, where is this getting the context from? MCP client is okay, user is interacting with, but where is this client interacting with? So this is where you have a server. So you have a server 1. So let me add 3 different servers: server 1, server 2, and server 3. So this is 2 and this will be 3. So let's understand this idea. Model context protocol. Model is your client where you have your Claude, where you have your cursor. Now comes the second keyword, context. In order to get the context to the model, you need to interact with the tools and resources. So these tools and these resources is where you have your server setup, right? So let's imagine your server 1 is nothing but it has a file system support. If Claude needs to read from a file, and if it has to save the response in a file, how does it do it? It needs to have some kind of permission that it needs to be given, right? So this is where the file system will give that permission, right? So file system MCP will allow Claude to interact with the directory. Whenever I tell, hey, generate this report and save it in a file, txt file, it will save the txt file in a desktop or document anywhere within your system. Now this is the file system where you can have certain tools that you can write. Now let's suppose second scenario where you have your Google Drive, Dropbox, Slack. So you have your data saved inside Google Drive, Dropbox, and Slack, and now you need to fetch this data to a Claude or any model. So how will you do that? Again, you can have a MCP setup which will interact with this particular resources. So here if you see, I told a keyword like tools. Here if you notice, I'm telling you a keyword called resources. At the end of the day, all these are the features of server. So the only purpose of server is interact with the APIs, get the context, give that context to the MCP client so that it can generate the response to the user. Now when it comes to the API setup and the context, it is in the standardized procedure, standardized rules. So this is where you have protocol. Now let's take one more example for server 3. Let's suppose you have Qdrant vector DB. So what you can do is write your prompt and tell Claude to save this prompt for the future purpose. Now whenever you want to use that saved question, right, what you can do is you can tell Claude, hey, can you look into my previous experience in the DB and generate me the response. So now we are saving and then retrieving. This is where you have Qdrant vector DB. So you can also perform different kind of RAG. So if you have seen my videos on my channel, there are tons of videos. So you can learn about RAG and then you can understand what the concept is about retrieval augmented generation and agents. So now that you have vector DB, there are different kind of support also you can give. For example, Airbnb. So if you want to get what are the listings of certain hotel in this particular time, you can have a MCP server like Airbnb and get the results from it. So not just Airbnb, if you want to interact with web browser, you have the MCP server for Brave browser, where you can directly interact with Brave and then get the results out of it and give it to the cloud model. So these are the few MCP servers. So in order to understand, you have the client, which is your model. Then you have MCP servers, which will fetch the context, model context. Now, how do these two things interact with each other? You have client, you have server. So this is where you have a transport layer between them. So you have a transport layer. So let's understand this transport mechanism, right, on how client and server interacts. So what client will do is it will initialize the request to the server and then server will initialize the response. So here, let's suppose you want to interact with a DB. This DB is where you have lots of poem about multiple animals, right? So now you need to generate a poem about cats. So you initialize the request, you check the database or resources in the server, and then server will also initialize the response. So the kind of communication that is happening is standard input and output. You can also call this as stdio. So this is one way to communicate, standard input and output. And the second way to communicate is SSC, that stands for server sent events. So this is mainly for HTTP based remote server setups. So now what will happen is, so once client writes any prompt, it will get inside stdin where the model will process the request, and once model will process the request, it will look into the server, and if there is any permissions that it needs to provide or it needs to fetch the data, server will process the data, and then you have std out, which will generate the final response where you are getting the received poem. So now this is the only thing that you need to remember. Client will initialize the request, server will initialize the response, and then you will have the connection setup where you can get the final response. Now that you understand what is MCP, how it works, and how the transport mechanism works, here is one syntax on how you can set up this file system. It's very simple. So here what we will do is, let's understand how you can connect a file system to a Claude desktop. So basically here MCP client is your Claude desktop and the MCP server is file system. So the syntax is very simple. If you are using Mac OS, what you need to do is you need to save a JSON file inside application support Claude, and the file name should be Claude Desktop config.json. Same goes for Windows. You need to get inside your app data Claude and you have to keep it in the same file. Now the syntax is very simple. What we need to do is, let me put a laser point. You need to start with a MCP server, and inside that you can define multiple server of your choice. So our server name is file system. So basically you have different kind of commands that you can run. So one command is, let me get back here. So one command will be npx. If you want to use JavaScript based installation, you can also have uvx for Python based installation. Then you also have docker. So these are the few commands that you can use in order to load that particular server. And once you have the command, the next thing is you need to have certain arguments. For example, you have by, which is providing the s permission for the directory that you have. For example, for the model context protocol server file system MCP, you need to give the file permission of your desktop, documents. If you want to give more permission of any directory, you just have to add the absolute path of it. That's it. So this is the syntax of how you can set up a MCP server for file system. So you have command, you have arguments. In some cases of MCP server, you will also see something called as env. For example, if you want to interact with Brave browser, you need to have the API key of Brave browser. Now that you have a basic syntax in mind on how to write MCP server setup to connect with Claude Desktop, what we will do is we will integrate Qdrant MCP Server that will help you to improve your vibe coding skills, and I will also show you how you can write two MCP server within the same JSON file. So let's look at the live demo. The first is we need to create a cluster on Qdrant Cloud. So the URL is cloud.qdrant.io. You can also find the link in the description. So the first step is we need the endpoint URL and as well as the API key. So what I'll do is I will enter a cluster name. So I'll just write it as MCP test. And now I just have to click on create free cluster. So it is gonna take few seconds and it will create a new cluster for us. And as you can see, it is creating the API key. You just have to copy the key once and save it somewhere. And now if you see one more thing, here if you look at the usage example, you have curl. In this curl command, you have HTTPS and then there is a URL which ends with a port called 6333. Okay. So you just have to copy this endpoint URL as well. Alright, so now that I've copied both my API key and as well as the endpoint URL, you just have to wait for some time until your cluster is active. So now if you see, it shows you healthy, that means your endpoint is active. Now I'll click on cluster again. As you can see, it is healthy. The status is healthy. Before we proceed next, you just have to ensure that you have downloaded the Claude desktop version, whether it is on Mac OS or Windows. As of now, it's not supported in Linux, so you can only use Mac or Windows system. So now since I'm using Mac, what I need to do is I need to open this particular URL or path. The path is inside library, you have application support. There you have Claude where it is installed. Inside there you need to create a new file. That new file is Claude Desktop config.json. Inside this I've already showed you the syntax on how MCP servers are written. So now what I need to do is I need to open an IDE. So I'll just write code, which is my default IDE. And then I'll just open the particular path where I need to save Claude Desktop config.json. Now if I click on enter, as you can see, it will open an IDE. Inside that, the syntax is again same. You have MCP server as your main key, and inside that you need to add Qdrant. So this Qdrant is my first MCP provider, and again you also have Airbnb, right? So as I said, I will show you an example of how you can use two MCP server at same time, right? So the next command, as you can see, for Qdrant I'm using UVX. Now how do I get this particular path? You just have to come back to your terminal and you just have to type which UVX, and then you will have the path. Same goes for which npx, you will have the path. So I've just copied this path and I've saved it inside the command. So if you look at Qdrant, I've copied the path of UVX, and if you look at Airbnb, I've copied the command of npx. That's it. Now we'll go with the arguments. In arguments, you just have to define the MCP server of Qdrant. It just stands for MCP-server Qdrant. And then you have env. Inside env is where we need to define the credentials. I've already defined the Qdrant URL, and as you can see, this is the endpoint that was created on the cluster. And then you have Qdrant API key, and this is the API key that was saved when I created the new cluster. And apart from that, there are two other things you need to notice. When it comes to vector database, you have your data. With data, you need to save the embeddings, right? So vector database can't save your raw data. It has to save your embeddings. This is where you also need to define the embedding model. Since we are using Qdrant themselves as a embedding provider as well, that is fast embed. As you can see, they also have something called as embedding provider. This embedding provider is nothing but fast embed, which is their open source library to convert the raw data into embeddings. So we will be using this embedding model, embedding provider, which again is default fast embed. So the only thing what we are defining is we are defining the embedding model. So now let's talk about collection name. Collection name is very important. Now you can just think collection name as a unique identifier. You are working on a project for vibe coding. You got a very reasonable response from Claude. You just have to save it. Now you are working on a different project, project 2. What you need to do is you need to create a new collection name. Whenever you want to save a new data inside a vector database, make sure you're creating a kind of version in terms of collection name. So this is very important. In my case, I've kept it code. So whatever code is generated from Claude, I need to save it inside vector database. So this is the instructions that I will provide to MCP Client, which is Claude Desktop. So this is it from MCP Server of Qdrant. Now once I close the parameter of Qdrant, I will create a new MCP server. So as you can see, I'm starting the MCP server, then you have Qdrant. Once I close the Qdrant, which is the blue color, I'm starting a new MCP server, which is Airbnb. So the command here is npx. I already showed you how to get npx. You just have to give which npx, and then arguments where I'm giving the permission along with the MCP server wherever it is hosted. And now there is also one more parameter. Whenever it comes to scraping data, right, you also need to ignore the robots text. So this is one additional argument that you're supposed to add whenever you're defining Airbnb. So now you are defining two servers. These servers can have multiple tools, they can have multiple resources. So this is the feature that MCP servers provide, right? So now if I open Claude Desktop, so now if you look at my Claude Desktop, let me zoom this a bit. In your case, you will just see this plus icon and this settings icon, but in my case, I can see two additional items. If you see, you have 4 MCP tools available. Now, why is it showing 4 MCP tools? I only have 2 MCP servers, right? So now if I click on this, you will see you have Airbnb listing details. So this is the tool that was created by Airbnb. Now you have Airbnb search. Again, this is the tool that was created by Airbnb server. So one server can have multiple tools. It can have multiple resources. And now if you look at Qdrant, it has from server Qdrant, you have Qdrant find, and then you have Qdrant store. So now let's imagine you're writing a code, you're vibe coding, and once you have a better response, you need to save it for future purpose, right? So now you will tell your Claude, which is MCP client, to save the data inside a vector database. So once it save it, it uses a function called Qdrant store. Now next time whenever you have to use this, you just have to tell, hey, from my previous experience, can you fetch the data from vector database? During that time, it will use Qdrant find. I will show you the demo. We'll see how it works in the action. Same goes for Airbnb. So now what I'll do is I will ask a prompt. We will start with Airbnb and then we will also look at two prompts of Qdrant where we will save the data and we will also retrieve the data, right? So let me write my first prompt. Since I'm traveling to Gandhinagar, Gujarat in the upcoming May 2nd, what I'm doing is I'm just asking MCP client, which is Claude, to give me the listing of Airbnb. So now if you see, provide me the Airbnb listing details for a 3-day 2-night stay from May 2nd to May 5th in Gandhinagar, Gujarat. So let me enter this prompt and check out the results. So now if you see, it is running this particular tool. You just have to look at this Airbnb search. So can you see this tool? It is asking you for a permission where you can tell allow for this chat. So this is the location, check-in date, checkout dates, and also the adults. So it's adding one automatically. If not, you can also define how many adults. Now again, I'll allow for this chat. If you notice this tool name, right, you have Airbnb search first and then you have Airbnb listing details. So these are the two tools that was supported by Airbnb server. So this is very good. According to me, since I travel a lot, this tool is very important to me because I book Airbnb very frequently. So for me, this is a very important tool. Now coming to the vibe coding part, right? So this is very important to those developers who wants to save their better code and use it for future purpose. So let me take an example. Since I am a ML engineer, what I will do is I will create a neural network using CNN, and whenever I define CNN, what I need to do is I need to have 3 convolution layers along with a max polling, and I need my dropout to be 0.4. So this is the instructions that I'm giving, and I need to save this code for future purpose. So next time whenever I ask to generate a CNN code, it has to have 3 convolution layers with 32, 64 and 128 units, and then it has to have a dropout which has 0.4. This is the basic requirement whenever I need to generate the code, and it shouldn't hallucinate. So this is where I'd be using MCP Qdrant server. So let me create a new chat and let me copy those instructions. I've copied the instruction. If you see, write a PyTorch code for CNN. Make sure every time I ask about CNN, I always need to have 3 convolution layers, 32, 64, 128, followed by max pull 2D, and I need to have a dropout layer of 0.4. And then I'll just say, save this to database or vector DB. So now what it will do is it will create the code first. As you can see, it is defining Qdrant store. I will click on allow for this chat. So this is the metadata that it is saving. So once it generates the complete code, it will save the code inside Qdrant collection name that you have provided. So now it has generated the complete code and it has also saved it in vector database. Just to verify, I will open Qdrant Cloud. So now if I see, you have this cluster MCP test. I will click on this. And now if you look at this open dashboard, I will click on open dashboard. In this dashboard, you have all the collection names that is saved. In my case, since I defined code, I will click on code. And this is what it did. PyTorch CNN architecture requirements. The type is code template. Then you have framework PyTorch, and then you have model CNN. And if you look at the requirement, each convolution layer followed by max pull, then a dropout layer with probability of 0.4. This is what I provided, and it is saved. Now what I'll do is I will create a new chat, and I will tell it to generate a CNN code, and then it has to fetch the information from Qdrant storage, right? So what function it will use? It will use Qdrant find instead of Qdrant store. So this is what you need to notice. I will create a new chat and I will ask, write a PyTorch code to implement CNN, look through DB. So now if I click on enter, it has to use Qdrant find to get the relevant information. As you can see, it is using Qdrant. I will say allow for this chat, Qdrant find. It is looking for PyTorch CNN implementation. I need to have 3 layers, 32, 64, 128 with dropout of 0.4. So you have 32, 64, 128, correct? Then you have a dropout of 0.4. This is what I needed, right? And this, when it comes to development, it becomes so crazy, man. Like for example, if you want to create a landing page and if you want to make some edit in landing page in a new chat, you can just save the data and use it for future purpose. Awesome. This is crazy. And this is just the first part of MCP server. There are two other parts. I will also show you what are the override statements in MCP in the upcoming videos. So the second video will be how you can use Google ADK, Agent Development Kit, using MCP. And in the third video, we will see how you can build your own MCP server and MCP client. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And again, share this video so that we can get most videos in the upcoming series as well. Thank you so much.